everyone. We're getting started. Um, Welcome to this afternoon's World Affairs program. My name is Catherine Lee, and I'm a freelance journalist. I reported extensively from Hong Kong for the New York Times as an intern and freelancer back in 2019 throughout the anti-extradition movement. I'm from Hong Kong, and I'm currently studying at the Grad School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, going towards narrative and investigative journalism. I'm also a member of the Hong Kong Affairs Association of Berkeley, which is a more academic and student advocacy group on campus. So let me introduce today's program host, World Affairs. It is a San Francisco-based nonprofit and nonpartisan forum that explores international issues and ideas beyond borders in all of the nuances and complexity. We're also honored to be joined by Alex Chow and Anna Kwok as panelists. They have contributed in the fight for democratic freedoms in Hong Kong. Alex's experience was fortified in 2014's umbrella movement, while Anna's experiences were more from the 2019 anti-extradition protest movement. Alex Chow is the former Secretary General of the Hong Kong Federation of Students during the 2014 umbrella movement. In 2017, he was sentenced to prison for 7 months. And in 2018, he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, along with Joshua Wong and Nathan Law for their contribution to Hong Kong's democratic movement. Alex is also now the board president of the Hong Kong Democracy Council and co-founded a magazine called Flow, which is the first Hong Kong diaspora magazine to be established overseas. So during the 2019 movement, Anna has led and organized several international media campaigns as an innovative force in a very decentralized movement. She also received her bachelor's degree in media, culture, and communication with a double major in philosophy at the New York University. That is also where she founded the NYU Hong Kong Student Advocacy Group to organize advocacy events around New York City. Currently, Anna is also with HKDC, and she develops strategic frameworks and implementation of plans. So a quick note for the audiences, if you have questions, you can ask it in the Q&A feature on Zoom. You'll probably see it at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer it at the end of our program. Anna and Alex, welcome to the World Affairs.
Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So there's plenty to unpack within the hour, so let's get started. So to begin with, a lot has happened in Hong Kong's history of pro-democracy movement, especially when it comes to youth awareness of democratic advocacy. Of course, some decades ago, the Tiananmen Square massacre back in 1989 was a huge trigger point for Hong Kongers in terms of social awareness, as well as the fear later on inspired by the potential of Article 23, which many now believe to be very similar to the current national security law. So throughout all of Hong Kong's social movements, so for the two of you, how did you start becoming highly aware and involved? What's the tipping point like for you? I'll start with Alex.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine, for the question. I think I first got involved into social movement or political activism back in around the time of 2011, 2012, 2013, when I was still an undergrad student, at the Hong Kong University back in Hong Kong. So in the very beginning, I was simply a literature lover. So when I got into university, what I hoped to do was to to write more, to be an editor of a campus magazine. But since my involvement of the campus magazine, then we just intendedly or unintendedly, we started to realize there was a lot of campus politics going on that has to do with the Communist Party's infiltration into student union, and through the control of the student union, then they could manipulate the voices of students and how they perceive the Hong Kong regime, and even the policy in China. At that very moment, that was perhaps why my awakening moment, coming to a realization that, oh Jesus, this is actually the politics going on in Hong Kong, in town, and there's a lot of things that we would not be able to see if we do not pay attention to. And if we start to pay attention to there's a lot of like, well, really insane and crazy tug of war battle happening in Hong Kong for many years, like, well, in the past, like, well, few decades after the Second World War, and Hong Kong has been a site of ideological contestation. So when I was a student, like, well, all those conflict and politics, suddenly, like, well, they were exposed to me. Then I realized that, oh, either I'm in it, or I would be like, well, dictated or be pushed away, like to like certain direction, or nowhere that I could like, well, have control of in the future. During my time as an undergrad student, and even after I graduated, like, while working in the city. So that has been like, well, the starting point of my journey. And like when I was an undergrad student, like, well, that was the time when like, well, more and more social movement and most mass mobilization, like, well, emerging in Hong Kong. Firstly, like, well, the 2009, like, well, a land movement on like, well, how to like, well, develop like Hong Kong as a city, whether like, well, the use of land should be allocated more to like a commercial center, like, well, business hub for more Chinese capital, or like, well, the land should be like, well, distributed and used like in a more like, well, equally distributed way, so that Hong Kong could build its economy like, well, into a more sustainable one, instead of like, well, simply like playing a role of a financial hub, or really like, well, decaying industrial center, like, well, in one of the East Asia economy. And then like, well, you also have like, well, the anti-national education movement, like, well, which was headed by Joshua Wong. If like some of the audience here realize that, like, well, the latest political development, there's like a huge reform on the educational system in Hong Kong. You could rarely talk about like, well, the British colonial era. Many of the foundation, like, well, sponsored by the British government back then, like, well, right now the Hong Kong government is considered to change the name. And like, well, the history books, like, well, the content are being like, was seriously rewritten. But like the fight like has originated like, well, going all the way back like to 2012, like, well, 2014, and so on and so on. Then in 2014, like, well, you have the umbrella movement broke out. Then that was the huge 79-day Occupy, having the inspiration coming from like, well, Occupy Wall Street, and like, well, other like, well, Occupy movement, like, well, across the globe. But that's like a background of like, well, my involvement. So there's like a lot of things like, well, happening in Hong Kong and also globally. So like, well, as a youngster, like, well, that was being sucked like, well, into this kind of like really crazy viral dynamic. Then it kicked off my my journey of activism.
Definitely. Definitely stemming from the movement, for example, to preserve farmland on the East New Territories, or to protect historical landmarks like the Queen's Ferry. That has definitely, and including the anti-national education protests, all of the above has actually built a very robust civil society in Hong Kong that really manifested itself to be a force to be reckoned with during the umbrella movement. And once again, when the extradition law was proposed. So I will ask Anna the same question for the anti-extradition movement. How did you first get involved?
Yeah, so thanks for your question. I think my story might be a bit different from what people usually expect from an activist, because usually people join, in the protests on the ground, and then they become more and more involved. But for me, it's actually kind of the opposite, that during the 2019 extradition movement, I was actually in New York for the majority of the time, because I was doing my undergraduate degree there, and I could not really go back to Hong Kong and, give up on my studies just yet. And that's why I was in New York, and I was really looking for a way to be part of the movement, because for me, I think there was a huge sense of loss, and there was a lot of guilt, feeling that my friends, people who are, I consider my family, are fighting back home and tasting tear gases and getting beaten up by the police. But me, I'm just sitting in front of a computer or sitting in front of a TV, like miles away from Hong Kong, and I couldn't do really anything on the ground to help. And that's why it was the sense of hopelessness and desperation that really brought me to think of new ways for me to join the movement. And that's why I started trying to connect with a lot of netizens who kind of had the same experience online. Like we were all outside of Hong Kong. We could not really join the protest immediately, but we really wanted to find ways to help. And that's why we started with organizing international campaigns, open letters to the United Nations, and things that try to engage with the international audience more. And eventually there was this occasion that was the G20 summit that was held in Japan at the time. And there was this idea of putting up international front page advertisements around the world. And that's why, and that's what I thought would be a really good campaign to pursue. And that's why I think within like a few hours, I gathered like dozens of netizens online, and we started this Instagram group, a Telegram group to organize around it. And within hours, we crowdfunded millions of US dollars to put these ads. And I think like three days or 5 days later, we managed to publish ads in like 13 newspapers around the world to really tell the international audience about what is going on in Hong Kong and what is that Hong Kong people want. Because I think at that time, people were not very aware of why Hong Kongers are fighting. But it's good to know that now people are having more awareness because of the kind of international campaigns that Hong Kongers have been pursuing. But that was really kind of the tipping point for me to consider myself to be part of the movement. Because back then, it's actually quite funny because in 2014, during the umbrella movement, I was doing my high school in Norway. So I was also like stuck outside. I couldn't go home. I had the same problem of wanting to do something, but I struggled to find a way. And in 2014, I managed to organize some on-campus event. But still, at that time, I think organizing from afar would not be considered as part of this Hong Kong movement. But in 2019, that dynamic has changed because overseas and global Hong Kongers have banded together to create a lot of new opportunities and told Hong Kong stories in a very constructive ways that eventually introduced our cause to the greater audience. And that's kind of the tipping point for me to join the movement. But actually, I had been this anonymous, person behind the computer for a long time, and it was only until sometime around last year that I decided to join HKDC with my public profile, with my real name, and I only came forward about my actual story a few months ago. And the reason for that, like the tipping point for that, is simply because I don't think that there's still a lot of us out here who can continue to speak the story simply because a lot of people who used to speak for Hong Kong are now in jail. And I thought we really need to take the fight up, and we really need new people in the scene. And one other reason that I decided to join and double down on my participation is because I was born in 1997, the year of the handover. And I remember as I grew up, people were always saying, oh, you guys are the future, like, your generation is going to be the leader of our Hong Kong. But then the Hong Kong they have given us is not a Hong Kong that we were promised. And I thought I didn't want to do the same thing to the next generation. And the least I can do for our next generation is for me to help them to fight for a future that we want to see. And that's why here I am right now fighting alongside people like Alex and you all to really hope for the freedom and democracy in Hong Kong.
Thank you for your answer. I really resonate with what you're saying because I was also born 1997. I was born just 6 months before the handover. I was a January baby. So
me too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we're almost exactly the same age.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely, you're right. The 2019 movement compared to 2014 has definitely evolved a lot, has become a lot more decentralized. What counts as the definition of participation has been very broadly expanded. So right now, obviously, we can see a dismantling of all the civil societies that have been built like decades ago in Hong Kong and also during Hong Kong social movements because of the national security law. So now that you both of you have seen different aspects of Hong Kong's democratic movement, how it has evolved, how do you think it is evolving now that under the national security law, which significantly limits all kind of speech and civil freedoms?
Oh, I could give it a try first. I think Catherine's question is extremely challenging one, because I think to that question, like many people who are concerned about Hong Kong's future and Hong Kong's ongoing movement, many people will find a situation like really challenging and difficult to accept. Some, like including myself, would even like describe it as like perhaps like the lowest point of the mass like resistance, since like since social movement has been like a critical tool for Hong Kong to like effect change in Hong Kong locally. Like even like Hong Kongers would not be able to like take part in the political system like equally and democratically. Not like the city leader, and not like every like lawmakers could be elected by like Hong Kong citizens. But there is like still like some sort of elements that you could like try to like work through the institution, like while trying to like play with the game, with the rules, maybe like through movement like outside the establishment, that you could really like shape like some of the policy like debate like within the establishment. But it seems like after the passing of the national security law in 2020, it is no longer the case. Like Hong Kong is like becoming more and more like mainland China, which means like the civil society in Hong Kong is just like mainland China. There's like no civil society, no independent civil society. Every like civic organization would not be able to receive like a donation overseas, so as to sustain like their goals, their projects, their initiative financially sustainably. And that's exactly what happened like in recent year, after like mainland China introduced the law in like forbidding like non-profit organization in receiving foreign donation. And what the Chinese government would do would try to like point finger and accuse like those like critical, rebellious like civic organization in mainland China as like subverting the state power. And that's exactly like the challenge that we are facing in Hong Kong right now. Like with the newly introduced national security law, almost like every political leaders, like politicians, leading activists, like public facing organizers in the movement, like they're either in jail, or they're being detained, or they have to go overseas, or they have to lay low for their own personal security and also for the well-being of their family members. And like no one could like speak up and speak against like the government and the regime, just because the political repercussion and the cost was so high. Like to the extent that like you would not be able to imagine like in the pre-national security era. So like in the past few years, political parties like they were either dismantled, or they decided like not to run for election. Like critical independent media like Apple dailies or Stand News like which are well known in Hong Kong, they're all forced to closure. And like the owner of Apple Daily, like the most single like critical voice like in advancing independent journalism in Hong Kong, the guy who's called Jimmy Lai, who's also a Christian, a Catholic, like he's detained. And like the trial is going on like and a trial like likely would like put him in jail for like more than 10 years. And that's the situation. And and the most ridiculous development like in recent weeks was like the act of like if folks like realize what happened in Britain, like the Queen Elizabeth II, like she passed away like recently, and Hong Kong people were like trying to mourn him, to like to like stage like all kind of like mourning activity like in Hong Kong and overseas. And the whole purpose, especially for people who are still in the city in Hong Kong, it is the only channel like in the past 3 years, the only channel, the only occasion that they could gather together like to stage a political action like in such a mass form. And without like being able to mourn or this occasion of like using like the passing, the death of like Elizabeth II, the Queen, there will be no occasion like Hong Kongers could come together, show the spirit as seen demonstrated in 2019, that kind of like a really visible, energetic, and influential, empowering like mass mobilization. You could no longer see it in Hong Kong. So that is also like the tricky part and the most challenging part, like how Hong Kongers on the ground, they could use their intelligence to stage different kind of political action to really weaken, insult, or protest against the foundation of the Hong Kong regime, the Hong Kong government regime or the Chinese Communist Party. So as to slap them or stage a protest, or to try to, as much as possible, to delegitimize the ruling foundation of the political elites in town right now. And another side of the same coin would be how overseas Hong Kongers, you and I in this room, or other people in the States, folks who have migrated to the UK or Canada, or are trying to find refuge in Taiwan, or folks in Australia, Japan, South Korea, how these people with a Hong Kong heritage could come together to persuade the global government, democracies to review the Chinese policy critically, so that we could restage and rethink what kind of economic policy, diplomatic policy that have shaped and consolidate the foundation of the Chinese communist regime to govern in a way that they do not have to pay cost. Wow, nourishing their whole financial wealth, so that they could be as brutal as possible to govern mainland China, to brutalize Hong Kong, as well as to blackmail overseas government and even ordinary people, to the extent that they could even adopt book owners with Hong Kong heritage, but with foreign passports, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, and other places back in 2015 and 2016, and that has been the case. So I think right now the challenging part would be how people in Hong Kong could survive, could preserve their resistance spirit, but also for folks who are not in Hong Kong right now to see Hong Kong's fight as a global fight, because the fight in Hong Kong is ultimately a fight against the way the governance rooted headed by the Chinese communist regime. And that's also exactly the same fight elsewhere, as how the Ukrainian people are fighting against the Putin regime, because we are fighting against a particular way of governing human beings in a way that policy is dictated by political elites that would only allow their peers to be able to enter this privileged cup, and know other ordinary people could really shape the policy debate and to reflect and ask for change on the effect and outcome of political policy, on economic policy, on environmental policy, on diplomatic policy. So that is at the core of Hong Kongers fight, and also at the core of this global fight to save humanity, starting from the local resistance, how we can substantially preserve the values and ideals Hong Kongers would like to preserve, the pursuit of freedom, the cherishing of equality, the love and adoration of democracy, equity, participation. So I think these are the people are still trying to preserve. Even they could not take part in the formal political institution to really change the establishment from within, but the movement itself are still embody this kind of spirit, to inherit the decentralized element, to allow different people to take their skills, take their talents, and try to nourish and nurture the movement, so that the resistance could be as creative and resilient as possible. And that's also how Anna Kwok transform herself from an anonymous activist into a public-facing activist, resurfacing in the public arena, for to come into the public horizon, to act in a different way. And also for myself, after the umbrella movement in 2014, I spent many years reflecting personally on how Hong Kong could further develop its economy in a more sustainable green manner. But only because of the crushing of Hong Kong's democracy with the national security law, I personally also have to transform myself, to come back to to the public stage again, and to see how we all our peers, most of our peers are being locked up. No one could no longer speak against the regime publicly, as the public-facing people of the movement, then how the remaining people in Hong Kong and overseas with still like, well, some degree of freedom could try to exert our autonomy to preserve the movement and to expand it so that like, well, this fight in Hong Kong, this fight like, well, in the global arena could really claim the ultimate and eventual victory, like, well, in the near term and also in the long run.
Thank you for your answer. Definitely, with the national security law in place, the stakes of activism has grown significantly higher. And me as someone who has built at least the beginning of my journalistic career back in Hong Kong, pretty much everyone I've ever interviewed and spoken to, and all the politicians I know, they're either in exile or locked up right now. And the people I used to see on a weekly basis, some of them, I don't know if I'll ever actually see them again, which is sometimes a very difficult emotional fact to contend with. So with the national security law, the overseas movement has been gradually gaining more importance because of the limited space in Hong Kong, which leads to my next question. What do you see in the future of the overseas Hong Kong community advocacy? What do you think is what do you think is important, and how do we go on from here? Because recently I have been seeing a lot of suggestions that we should become more centralized and vote to decide who should represent us. And it is a controversial suggestion, given that this movement it started out as something uniquely decentralized, and no one seems to have come up with like a feasible mechanism to achieve this centralization. So what do you think we should do going forward? And what should we change about what we already have now overseas, if anything?
Yeah, I can definitely try, answering that question. And I think, connecting to the last question you asked about the trajectory of Hong Kong's movement, right? I think it's really interesting to see how from 2014 to 2019 to right now, the Hong Kong movement is constantly expanding the audience and also the regions and the sectors that we have been covering. So for example, in the 2014 movement, it was largely a very geographically based movement, right? Because it was Occupy Central. So most of the things that was happening on the ground was happening either in Admiralty or in Mong Kok. So these two are, the spots where things were happening. But in 2019, with more people, more Hong Kongers around the world joining the movement and finding ways that I talked about earlier of contributing to Hong Kong, it seems that Hong Kongers have found a way to expand the collective, the Hong Kong collective, into a more global community that we can always assert our presence as long as there's a Hong Kong there, right? But during the 2019 movement, I think most of the initiatives were more community-based. So for example, there would be a protest in New York City, for example, along with places like London, Sydney. They will all have a protest on the same day to really amplify the voice of Hong Kongers. And there were also some initiatives or some attempts to do global advocacy trips. But still, I think at that point in 2019, Hong Kongers were still trying and learning to plug into the global political scene and the global movement in general. But I think right now, because of what Alex had laid out very clearly and very comprehensively earlier of the difficulty of doing anything in Hong Kong, really the burden has shifted to people outside of Hong Kong to do meaningful political action. And this is where your question comes in, right? So how are we going to organize, and how is our diaspora going to move forward? I think, in my opinion, what I want to do personally, or where I see the change lies in, is really to construct a political diaspora. And what it means is that when we think about diaspora, I think the first question that people usually ask is, how are we going to preserve our cultural identities, and how are we going to preserve, our language and things like that? I definitely think that they're important, but I think another important question is definitely on how do we continue or preserve our political identity? How do we preserve our identity as freedom-loving and democracy-loving individuals? And that is important because I think that for people to participate and for people to use political power. They don't have to be, in the political arena. They don't have to be an activist or a politician or anything like that. Actually, in most countries, everyone has their political power. For example, in the United States, even though you're not involved in any kind of political organization, you can still call your Congress member, call your constituent, and ask them, about the situation in Hong Kong and ask them for support. And I think this form of activism and advocacy is actually what we really need in the diaspora. I think the first step is for everyone to have the consciousness that they are all a political individual, no matter what they are. And I think oftentimes people are too limited are in perceiving the kind of political power they have. Most people think that, oh, I'm not, directly in the political scene or policy scene. It's difficult for me to make a change. But I want to debunk that myth, because no, like, everyone can be a change maker. Especially, I think, because after 2019, we have seen how grassroots advocacy is really important, and how everyone, even like pasting flyers around your neighborhood, can actually make a difference and make more people be aware of Hong Kong. And that's why I think that is the trajectory, and the movement that we're evolving into is really to break first the idea of what counts as making political changes, and second, realizing the potential you all have, and thirdly, I think is really expanding our audience. So our audience doesn't have to only be Congress members, people with actual legislative power. They can be people in different industries. For example, if you work in the entertainment industry, just try to talk to your companies and your business partners about doing less business with CCP-backed business owners. That is also a very important political act that each of us can do. And that's why I think what we have to do right now is really to realize and maximize all the power we have on our hands. And that's how we can eventually build a diaspora powerful enough to make constructive and actual changes. But I think the challenge actually lies in actually what you mentioned about some people seeing the need of centralization. I think the core reason for that is the fear of two things. The first worry is that we can no longer stay coherent. So how are we going to stay coherent in the policy priority or the imagination we have for Hong Kong? I think that is something that people are struggling with, and that's why there's a call for a more centralized organization. But even with that said, it doesn't have to be a top-down organization, right? I think it was really exemplified in the 2019 movement to see how a bottom-up movement is possible. And it's possible in a way that even if there are a million initiatives taking place at a time, we can still somehow find enough space and enough understanding to be coherent in the things that we ask for. And I think secondly, the biggest challenge for I think personally is definitely the fear of losing trust over time, because it's a huge element that should not be overlooked. A lot of the times when we think about politics, we may think of strategic competition or how to play strategies and things like that. But I think fundamentally it's about humans, and it's about the bond and interaction between humans. And that said, I think the strongest power that Hong Kong community has is the trust we have built in 2019. And that is why it's very important to maintain that trust. And once we have lost that trust, we actually don't have anything left, because we have already lost, the city that we used to live in. And that's why I appreciate and I understand why people want a more centralized organization, but I just think that we can expand our imagination more on what kind of centralizing organ it has to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a top-down approach. It can be a bottom-up approach. And there are also a lot of ways to imagine and perceive new possibility with the technology that we have used in the past few years and we have developed in the past few years. So I'm quite actually, even though we're in a desperate time, but still, I have a bit of hope of what our diaspora can achieve collectively, because I think we have really opened a lot of paths for horizontal organizing and global advocacy that can, drive us somewhere in the future.
Thank you for your answer. It's definitely very important to stay united, and despite despite certain agreements and despite certain differences in opinions, a lot of times one community really needs to put aside differences and focus what we can work on together to make it a more sustainable movement. Another suggestion, well, I've been talking to some other Hong Kong community Bay Area leaders lately, and I've been hearing them tell me that there has been an increasing, there has been a decreasing amount of participation in any direct action events like protests or anything that takes direct action. So we've really been thinking about how different organizations can pivot. And for example, like you have suggested, become business leaders, become union leaders, or like how to really engage and become part of the community to kind of exercise our soft power to make this movement sustainable. So what do you think we should particularly work on that aspect? How do you think these could be achieved? And what do you think our message should be to our like fellow Hong Kong people?
Anna, do you want to go first, or?
You can go.
Yeah, I can give a very short response of, things that are off the top of my head. I think the first thing is definitely, talking to your representatives. Like these are very straightforward and I think intuitive answers that we have. But secondly, I think one very important thing is really to break into the private sector. And by that, I mean mostly the finance and business sector. And that is because Hong Kong has always been known as this international financial hub. And I think for overseas businesses or foreign businesses, including American companies, to conduct business in Hong Kong, they have to understand the cost. And the cost is not only about, having to be careful or having to be careful about the things you say or silencing yourself, but instead, actually, when you are cooperating with a Chinese business, eventually they will try to use that economic influence or the reliance you have on them to coerce you into doing things that are actually not good for your industry or for your company. Because there have been a lot of reports of how over the years, like American companies or foreign companies have eventually realized, for example, their designs have been stolen, or their companies have signed agreements that were breached so many times, but there's really no way to hold them accountable. I think these are cases that deserve some sort of highlighting to really understand it's not only about compromising the sort of freedom of expression, but is actually compromising a lot of values and also integrity that businesses have when they do conduct business in Hong Kong. And I think secondly, it's also very important, I think, to talk about the entertainment industry, because even though the entertainment industry is sometimes understood as being very far away from the political scene and the policy scene, but actually is really not far away. Because I used to actually work in the film industry. I aspire to be a film director, and I'm strongly convinced that a lot of public discourse is actually created by soft media, films, and the creative industry, and it can really have a very profound impact on how people perceive different symbols and different terms that are invoked in our conversation. So for example, I think Hollywood has to learn to decouple from Chinese investors, because we have seen that increasingly Chinese investors have been using Hollywood movies to perpetuate some sort of impression or idea of mainland China being this prosperous country that really respects multiculturalism, for example. But we know it's not true, because if they were respectful of multiculturalism, they wouldn't be really conducting against humanity in Xinjiang, against Uyghurs, or against Tibetans, and a lot of these ethnic minorities. And that's why I think it's really important to target these different industries and be more creative about the possibilities we have. But because the CCP is actually very creative, they use whatever means that they can get to perpetuate the sort of discourse or rhetoric that they want to spread around the world. And that's why we have to be mindful, we have to be conscious, and we have to be careful about the kind of industry that we are in, and to navigate on ways that we can actually counter these sort of CCP influences around the world.
Yeah, building on what Anna just said, I would have to agree that I would have to agree that we would need to rethink different industry specifically how do they interact or do business with mainland China or with entity in mainland China. So recently a couple of weeks ago we had a committee, we had a meeting with many committee members, and many of them are with professional background, either they're scientists or they are entrepreneurs, and or they are engineers, and the interesting commonly shared perspective from them is they're all very concerned about how business conducted business with mainland China, and where is the capital going, and whether those capital going into China could really reward this democracy based Western business, whether they are sustainable enough to really navigate and traverse these escalating climate and confrontation between US and China. And I think that just 2 days ago or a few days ago, we also read from news that the European Union and also the European countries, they're also reconsidering their strategic relationship with China. They are on the verge of abandoning the concept of strategic partnership, and they are rather opting for a more cautious approach, saying that they should stop being naive when they deal with China, because the way the economy was handled in the past few decades, it ultimately bring a detrimental effect, harming their national security interests. So if that's if this kind of perspective is becoming more and more of a trend across democratic countries, that it seems we have reached a tipping point. There's no return. That the escalation would just becoming more and more of a phenomenon, they're going all the way back, in the past 30 and 40 years, that there'll be peaceful coexistence. And I think in the China field, scholars, the China's study scholars, they've been saying it has become more and more challenging and difficult to conduct research in China. There's almost no way for them to conduct independent fieldwork research that could last long, safely and securely. So they are also very concerned about the future and the livelihood of whether China studies could survive this winter. And many mainland China activists organizers, they've also hosted a private internal meeting on how they could cope with the crackdown happening in mainland China. And the background information for that meeting is that more and more capable political activists and organizers in mainland China, they're trying to leave China because they do not see a room existed for them to do any kind of organizing work or political work, meaningful political work. That also meant the ecosystem, the foundation, the landscape in mainland China and Hong Kong, they've been severely shifted. And when it comes to be what could be predicted, many people more or less hardly to avoid, they have to point to the tension between Taiwan and mainland China, where when especially now China's economy is going downturn, and the wealth is extremely unequally distributed, and the economy has to change from a more export-led economy to a more hyper internal consumption. If they could not make the shift orderly and securely, then maybe the Xi government would try to shift the blame by waging a war against Taiwan. So the domestic debate would pay more attention to the external threat and the military conflict. than the economic crisis that's happening domestically. So there are many emerging signals that is really alarming and cautious, and that might also point to some of the potential solution that Hong Kongers globally could seek. And it seems like one of the principle would be that we have to look the long term. We have to look at the long-term development instead of simply the near-term direct action that might be generate enough pressure for immediate policy change that could help liberate Hong Kong, because it seems the thing would no longer be that naively perceived and imagined. When the change comes, it would be a huge tectonic shift that might requires a huge amount of talents across scopes to work on the aftermath and how we could rebuild Hong Kong from chaos. And it seems we are more and more approaching that scenario than the other way around.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to have 15 minutes for our audience questions. So our first audience member, Yik Song Leung, has asked, he said, thank you for all your efforts and insights. In your opinion, is there a way to restore the early momentum of mass mobilization in the face of the national security law? How does international involvement affect this momentum? Either of you can take that question.
Yeah, I think, it's a good question. And I understand a lot of people probably have, the same thought of hoping the momentum can be restored the same way. But I think right now it's important to think about the timing in the sense of, even if we have the momentum right now, is the global affairs as things stand right now the most appropriate or the most strategic for us to really get what we want? And so what I'm saying is that even if there's a mass momentum of mass mobilization right now, and 2 million Hong Kongers go onto the streets right now, if the global international society is not ready to fight for Hong Kong, to really pick up the fight against the CCP to get Hong Kongers freedom and democracy, it would be difficult for us to really utilize that timing. And that is why I think it would be important to think about the timing instead of whether we can have the momentum first. But I do believe that the momentum can still be there if there is a window of opportunity for Hong Kong, because you see that right now, even though there's such a hefty price to pay in Hong Kong to express yourself politically, we still see Hong Kongers trying to find ways to, for example, sing "Glory to Hong Kong" or chant Hong Kongers, fight on, these kind of very politically charged slogans and actions inside of Hong Kong. So we know that Hong Kongers is still there and the spirit is still there. They're still waiting to have the perfect moment to fight back. But right now, I think it's for us to really prepare ourselves and to equip ourselves with more and better skills and strategies in order to really seize the chance when the opportunity is here, and when things align the right way, and then we can get the freedom we want.
So moving on to the next question. An anonymous attendee asked, what are your thoughts on these two recent campaigns proposed by some Hong Konger groups? One, decoupling twin sister relationships with China. And two, going after events that are hosted by HKETO and protesting at their events.
Yeah, I think I can also quickly answer those good questions. So we're extremely supportive of them. And actually, those two initiatives also came up when we held our Hong Kong Summit in July, where we invited a lot of Hong Kong diaspora members and organizers to participate and discuss what are some strategies to move forward. So firstly, decoupling twin sister cities' relationship with China is very important, because we mostly focus on federal and national level of diplomatic ties. But actually, there are a lot that the city governments and state level can do. And they have a lot of existing, for example, business deals or diplomatic ties established with China that actually give platform to the CCP to perpetuate some sort of misinformation and also propaganda that they can use these events that they host to talk about and spread. And that's why decoupling those relationship is good in a way that you cease giving them that kind of platform to speak to community members and people who don't really understand what's going on. And secondly, it's sending a signal that, you know, the international society is really watching them and really turning away from the sort of deal with the devil that they have been trying to make over the years. And that's why we really appreciate and really support this sister city relationship. And secondly, going after events hosted by the HAETO. So for audience who don't really know, so HAETO is the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, and they have actually opened office in a lot of cities around the world, including in the United States. That would be in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, DC. And these HAETO offices, they would do something that look harmless. So for example, last week, they hosted some jazz, you know, music concerts and reception in New York City and in DC. And I actually went to protest outside of the one in DC because they use these occasions to invite a lot of people that they're friendly with, especially, for example, business owners and government officials that they want to spread their propaganda to signal to these people that Hong Kong is business as usual, Hong Kong is safe to go, Hong Kong is a prosperous city that they should consider relocating or expanding their business at. But we all know it's not the truth, right? Because of the national security law, and Hong Kong is no longer safe to even express their opinion. And that is why it's really important to monitor what kind of people and what kind of rhetoric the HAETO is trying to spread, because they have been acting as a mouthpiece for the CCP. And that's why we encourage these initiatives a lot, and we at HKDC Hong Kong Democracy Council, we're also devising, you know, initiatives and campaigns around not only HKETO but also other things that the Hong Kong government are doing overseas. So, for example, recently there has been a report published by the Freedom House on how Beijing has been utilizing its global influence to really censor or, you know, change some of the things that people are saying overseas. So, for example, the Hong Kong government actually wrote a letter, I think, to some newspaper in London and asking them to change, you know, the way that they talk about Hong Kong, and really to ask them to censor themselves. And I think these are very important things that we have to notice, because if we just let them slide by, the Hong Kong government and the CCP is just gonna like keep doing it, and they'll just leverage the economic influence they have around the world to keep spreading the sort of misinformation that they have. And that's why having HAETO initiatives, Hong Kong government monitoring initiatives is very important. And I really encourage people in the audience to join and perhaps inquire your city and your state whether they have an existing relationship with Hong Kong government or the HAETO. And if so, it would be good to tell them to not to do it, because they are really supporting the dictatorship and the regime that has killed millions of people.
Thank you. So next question, also from an anonymous attendee. My understanding is that Western social media platforms are very popular in Hong Kong, as opposed to Chinese platforms like Weibo or WeChat in mainland China. How are social media platforms responding to the CCP's restrictions and influence in Hong Kong? And how would you like to see them respond?
Alex, do you want to answer this one, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe Anna, you could also chime in. So to my knowledge, like, well, so far, like, well, the Western social media in Hong Kong, they still have some freedom. They still enjoy some freedom and leeway, like, well, to operate their business in Hong Kong. But it depends really on, like, well, the wider political circumstances and also the wider political climate, like, well, how that will go, like, well, in the months and years to come. Because, like, well, the Hong Kong government, like, well, in the past few years, they considered to, like, revamp and amend, like, well, the law that could, like, well, that would that would require all the technology companies, the Western companies, to submit data and information when requested by the police task force or the Hong Kong government. That meant privacy might no longer exist in Hong Kong. There might no longer be any way of free and secure channel that could be used and adopted by Hong Kongers on the ground, for resistance purpose or communication purpose. And in recent weeks, we also see from news that there's a exposure on Twitter, the digital platform company. There are some really patriotic Chinese employees that have been doing a lot of work that would leak and transfer information to the Chinese regime, and that those kind of really tricky invisible internal operation is also in one way or the other impacting the company policy and how the policy and information are being preserved and retained. So I would say even right now the Western social media, they still have some leeway to operate and function in Hong Kong. They might face more and more restriction and legal requirement that force them to submit data to the Hong Kong regime. And if that's the case, then there would no longer be any protection to users in Hong Kong. And one legislation being considered in issue right now is to request American companies to abide to American law when they are requested by the Hong Kong government or the Chinese government to submit data and information to the regime upon any kind of request. So that might be another tug of war policy struggle on whether the American companies abide to the American laws more, or they simply have to succumb themselves when the oppression comes.
I see. So due to time, we're probably gonna have two more shorter questions. So one of the questions is from another anonymous attendee. For those of us who do participate in activism protests in the US, how should we handle fears of racism that comes with the anti-China sentiment?
And Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this is definitely an extremely tricky question that we have been grappling with. I think it's, there are a lot of ways to look at it, and there are multiple levels of layers that we have to unpack. But one thing that I have been thinking about, or I have encountered, is I can talk a bit about my experience on the Hill with some legislators, and Alex can follow with other aspects perhaps. So there were times that I was speaking to legislators. They have expressed openly and honestly with me that sometimes they're afraid of commenting on US-China relations, or even the political crackdown in Hong Kong, or even the human rights atrocities that have been happening, just because they are worried to be identified or perceived as China bashing if they say something bad about the Chinese government. And I think it's very troubling because we, on one hand, I agree that racism should be something that we talk about, and should be something that we try to tackle to really eliminate all systematic oppression. And on the other hand, it's very troubling to see how the CCP is being connected to the Chinese people and equate to the Chinese people, and how there's always there can be this thinking that, oh, if you're talking badly about the CCP, it means you're being racist to Chinese people because that's their culture or something. But I think it's even more racist to not recognize that there's a variety of views, and there's different opinions within this group called Chinese, right? So and that, I think it's even more racist to think that, oh, Chinese means they are, supporters of the CCP or something like that, because in a lot of cases we know that there are a lot of Chinese people who are oppressed by the CCP and they do want to stop the regime, but they just don't have the power. So I think when we're faced with that kind of confusion between Chinese people, the CCP, and China, it's important to say that what we're fighting for is we're fighting against the dictatorship and the regime that perpetuates this kind of human rights atrocity, instead of fighting against Chinese people. So we're also targeting, people who in other societies who support the CCP as well. And that's, I think it's something that we have to work on, and we have to continue debunking that myth of Chineseness being, associated with the CCP and supporting whatever the CCP does.
I see. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. I realize I have 2 more questions I've not gotten to. Sorry to the audience members. To wrap it up, thank you very much for your time, Alex and Anna. It's been such a pleasure having you both here. And Alex and Anna, could you tell us about how can everyone follow you all on social media? And at the moment, what can everyone do to help our community and to help achieve the goals that we talked about?
Yes, so to follow us on social media, you can follow Hong Kong Democracy Council, which is the organization we're working with on the latest updates on Hong Kong and the initiatives we have been doing in terms of advocacy work, diaspora building, as well as research and education work on Hong Kong. And Hong Kong Democracy Council is, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can find us on all these platforms. And the 2 of us are also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And things that you can do for Hong Kongers is, first thing is definitely calling your legislator, your representatives, and your senators about Hong Kong, and asking them to co-sponsor or support legislations that support Hong Kong and our future. So one legislation that I can point you to is definitely the Hong Kong Business Integrity and Transparency Act that has been recently proposed. And another one is definitely some humanitarian pathway provisions to help Hong Kongers to come to the US and seek the safe haven that they need to come to stay here and to avoid political persecution if they do go back to Hong Kong. So there's this QR code on the monitor right now, which will lead you to a website called Call for HK. It's under construction now. We need to change some of the wording and the legislation that we are advocating for, but it's simply a tool that helps you to write your Congress member directly, so that you can let them know as their constituent you care about this issue, and hope that they can represent you as your representative to cast a vote that is actually meaningful to you. So Alex, do you have anything you want to add?
If you are non-Hong Kongers, I would really welcome you to interact or take part in some of the Hong Kong or community events in your city or in your region, and to try to as much as possible to support these community groups, because they are the core and the foundation of the Hong Kong movement overseas, in the US and beyond. So your support to or kind of community organization supporting Hong Kong's cause, that would be a tremendous support to really sustain the movement to go an extra mile to the date that we could see a free, liberated Hong Kong emerge for us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Anna and Alex, and thank you for your time today. We all know it's never an easy thing to be far away from home and to be doing advocacy work, because being in exile is also very emotionally taxing on everyone who is involved. So thank you both. If anyone wants to learn more about the World Affairs, you can head to their website, which is www.worldaffairs.org, where you can find out about their upcoming live stream events and also in-person events. A special mention of an upcoming program is with Cody Keenan and Dime Pfeiffer, who are key staff in the Obama White House. It's going to take place on the evening of October 13th. So you can join this in-person online program for a behind-the-scenes look into how the White House seeks to respond to dramatic breaking news. Thanks very much to you, our audience, and for taking the time to be with us. Feel free to follow us on social media and reach out, and stay tuned for more World Affair events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.